The story of Ronnie Charles is an incredible story, an amazing journey, as Pete Townsend once said. While the origin of Ronnie's music career is entrenched in Australia, the magic happened in the UK. This is the story of a guy who had chart success in Australia with the Groop, and not long after was front and centre of the biggest evolution in music culture in the United Kingdom. The incredible Prestidigitation album was recorded with the London Symphony Orchestra and English Chamber Choir, and until now has been rarely talked about. There are twists and turns to the story along the way, and here is Ronnie to tell that story. And welcome, Ronnie.
It's good to be here.
Prestidigitation.
Prestidigitation.
All right, this is...
Just keep saying it and we'll get it right.
Prestidigitation. It's a story that should be told. I'm surprised something that you created so long ago has taken so long to get to the point where we're actually sitting here with a physical copy and talking about what is effectively a piece of art.
Well, it's the art of prestidigitation. Look, for me, it was asleep for years and years. It wasn't really until I did the Go Show, a few Go Shows about 10 years ago, that I did a CD version, spin-off the album for digital to sell singles of Layla, just because everyone else was selling stuff at the Go Show. I thought I may as well dig something up that isn't just the group, which of course was my background in Australia. So that's where it started. And once I'd done the digital transfer, I thought, well, I may as well go ahead and do the whole album, and as I owned the album. So then the big sort of comeback for it is in the last couple of years because of the vinyl revival. And Bruce Hutchins and a guy called Frog got in touch with me to do a vinyl version of it, and we've taken on the task of getting the thing pressed to vinyl and remastered for vinyl, which is a separate process, and I've had the opportunity to repackage it too, because the original album cover, which is over here, lacked a lot of information about the story behind the album, so it's given me the opportunity to actually put down, on the album what the album is really all about and why it came about.
I guess, before we get to the story of the album, we have to get to the story of how the story of the album came about. It was really about some really young guys in a rock and roll band in Australia who headed overseas. That included you. You had some friends at the time who have also gone on to big things later in the years.
Well, it was the beginning of a journey for a lot of people. What I always call the early push for Aussie music overseas started really in 66, 67, when the Twilights won the first Battle of the Sounds, the Hoadley's Battle of the Sounds, and took off, and they spent about 6 months over there and recorded What's Wrong with the Way I Live. Yes, and came back with Carnaby Street Gear and everything else, and a whole sort of new take on their repertoire. And so the following year, everybody went into the Battle of the Sounds, and I mean the Loved Ones, the Masters Apprentices, Max Merritt, Doug Parkinson, the Groop, Mixtures, everybody was into it. But I think what the group had in our favour and why we won the 67 Battle of the Sounds is Woman You're Breaking Me, which was our second single, and we'd only been together 12 months, charted at #1 the week of the final. And I think that had a big sort of impetus in terms of the crowd enthusiasm and to a large degree our performance, because the group were a very tight band. Apart from doing the regular gigs that most bands did in those days, the group did a lot of private corporate and society gigs all over Melbourne, because Brian Cadd and I, when we joined the group, inherited their workload, which the group Mark I, who had had a couple of albums and a couple of singles in the early 60s, were they had this big workload. So we were able to actually work and make the band very tight, but also make a bit of money. So consequently, when we went to London in '68, we had plenty of money in our pocket to buy a transit van and a PA and a Hammond organ, and ended up touring there for 10 months, including playing at the Marquee and the Playboy Club, and we went to Germany because we had a hit in Germany with Nightlife, which was the second single after Woman You're Breaking Me, and then came back to Australia, did Such a Lovely Way. Max Ross left the group, the bass player, and the band sort of had done the full circle at that point, especially from the older boys in the band who were there from the word go in '64. But for me as a 19-year-old going there in '68 was a real eye-opener, and it was also something that affected me in a way that I thought, well, this is where I need to be if I want to do something long-term in the music industry, because these were the days when people said, what are you going to do when you're 30? As a singer, you think beyond that, and like John Farnham and other Ronnie Burns and other singers of that time, after the group broke up, I went solo and did Katie Jane and...
tinker, a thief, and a tailor man opened up their hearts to Katie Jane. She told gentle lies only some voices can. When they were one, came the end of the game. Like a rook on the wing was the sweet Katie Jane.
Did a single with the Aztecs, and also did a solo single called Captain Australia and the Honky Tonk, which was during the famous record bans of the late 60s. And then really once the 70s came along, it was sort of the end of an era. And rather than sort of just wear suits and go out and do solo gigs, I had this thing in my head about going back to the UK and give it a shot for a couple of years, and ended up ultimately staying for 15 years and doing quite a lot, including the London Symphony album.
Yeah. So, all right, we've got the group there. It's amazing. I mean, you tell a story that sounds like a history that went on for decades. Yeah. It was such a short piece of time, wasn't it? And there was even something before that. So the group was actually the second band, wasn't it? Right. You were also involved with Somebody's Image. That's right. Before we even get to the group.
Yeah, well, there were three distinct stages of the 60s. There was the early 60s, which I call the kind of Billy Thorpe, post Johnny O'Keefe, Billy Thorpe, Somewhere Over the Rainbow, Billy Thorpe, Normie Rowe, Que Sera, all that sort of stuff. And then the middle 60s was when bands, which coincided with the arrival of 8-track recording, bands like the Masters and the Group and the Loved Ones in particular, who were doing original music, because most bands recorded cover versions of stuff. Look, bands in the early 60s really recorded to get more work. It wasn't so much, yes, if you could get played on the charts, on the radio, that was great, but you were competing with the international playlists, which were quite busy at that time, because of post-Beatles, Rolling Stones and all that, there were so many great records. I mean, when Woman You're Breaking Me was in that top three, it was All You Need Is Love and Whiter Shade of Pale were either side of the record. So that was the sort of competition you're up against. But a lot of bands recorded records really just so that they had something for their fans when they went out and performed in Melbourne's very healthy live music scene, which it was then.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the recordings in the early part of the 60s were singles. The albums sort of developed in the latter part of the 60s, didn't it?
We're lucky because we were CBS, and CBS were sort of more run as an international label, because it was the Australian Record Club was the franchise for it here, and that's how they operated. A lot of the smaller independent labels like Spin, were exactly as you say, just singles type. They just do singles.
Yeah.
So we were very lucky like that. Yeah.
There was a very interesting story with Spin too, wasn't it? Because the founder of Spin also had a son who went on to success as well, all at that time that you were doing the thing overseas.
Nat Kipner, who was Spin, also wrote Too Much, Too Little, Too Late for Johnny Mathis, and his son wrote Physical for... He then later moved to the States in the 70s, and Hard Habit to Break for Chicago. So that was all in the family.
Yeah. So you're involved in a very interesting circle, weren't you?
Well, it was all everyone was doing great things then. I mean, we're talking about the loved ones. What inspired Woman You're Breaking Me was when we were managed by the same guy. When we heard The Loved One, we were just knocked out, and we thought, what's great about it is if you saw the loved ones live and you heard that record, that's what you got. And we thought, we've got to have our particular style, So we put our heads down and came up with Woman You're Breaking Me, which then broke for us when we took off to London. Where it was breaking for us was in the States. But in those days to go to America was very, very difficult because of the Musicians Union situation in America to get a green card. Virtually impossible. There were very few artists. Only Lynn Randell was the only artist that went over as a solo artist in the 60s and managed through a bit of manoeuvring by her very good manager, Carol West, to get herself and record that fantastic single, Chow Baby. So, look, all those things were kind of inspiration for us. And the other big break for the group is Paul Jones, after he left the Manfred Mann band, recorded a song that Max Ross and Brian Cadd had written for Ronnie Burns called When I Was 6 Years Old. And they released that as a single in England. So when we arrived in England, we kind of had a bit going for us, and then we got a stint at the newly opened Playboy Club, and that was a good showcase for us. And then we just started working to the Marquee Club, and then started touring up and down the M1 in our new transit van, living in Chelsea and everything. So all that had a big impression on me. And, as I say, when that time came and the band broke up and I was looking at what you can do now in the 70s, I thought I'd go and give it a shot.
Yeah, well, so when you arrived in England, you already had a great resume. You already had a lot of success. I would imagine that, you just can't pick up the phone and talk to somebody like Lou Reizner. Was it as a result that you already had a track record that he took the call?
Well, no, it wasn't that. There were a couple of years there. I had a day job and all sorts of things. There were people there already, David Joseph and Glenn Wheatley, who was working for him. He was just his apprentice, if you like. Keith Podka. People gave us studio time because I was writing songs with Les Goff, who was myself and founding members of Atlas, which was the band we started there with two English guys. And we started working that band once we'd sort of, because you had to be more original over there. You just didn't go out like you did in Australia and do covers of Searchers songs or Animal songs or whatever. You had to do your own thing. And we were playing at a place called the Pheasantry in 1972 in off Kings Road in Chelsea. And this big, tall guy who looked very much like Frankenstein's monster with makeup walked in and was standing at the bar, and he was getting into the band, and I went up and introduced myself to him because someone said, "This is Kim Fowley. He's a very interesting character. You should talk to him." And he was telling me how he'd just done the promotion for Daddy Cool in the States.
I think he even co-wrote a song with Ross.
That's right, yeah. And he said, "I'd really like to hear your stuff," and we'd done a few demos, as I said, including Don Arden gave us some studio time.
Don Arden, who is Sharon Arden, is his daughter, who married Ozzy Osbourne, became Sharon Osbourne.
Well, and he managed the Small Faces and a few other bands, the Kinks at one point, and Kit Lambert and all those managers that were around there. They were very hard-nosed people, and in the 70s it was difficult because what had happened is pirate radio had finished. So in the era when you had the Cream, Hendrix and all that era had gone, and really the only radio in England was Radio 1. And Radio 1 was very middle of the road. And by middle of the road, I mean, apart from sort of playing, you know, more balladero type material, it was Susie Quattro, it was gimmicky, kind of the sweet. It was all that very kind of easy listening, friendly rock and roll type stuff. And there's a whole series of Top of the Pops and in that era when all those early 70s when all those records came out. You know, it was the beginning of ELO when it was Roy Wood was fronting ELO, Electric Light Orchestra. Yeah, several people, and then of course David Essex came along. He was probably one of the new kids on the block then. But that was quite different to the existing market of Pink Floyd and Led Zeppelin, and of course people like David Bowie, who was a Ziggy Stardust thing. They were doing the big tours and putting out albums. All these other bands were just having singles. So to get a record deal was really hard. But Kim, who was over there recording an album called International Heroes, invited us to help him do a bit of work on that. Our guitar player worked with him on that. And he put us in the studio overnight on his studio time to put down not just 3 or 4 demos, to put down over 2 nights, 10 tracks, what would be a mock-up of a complete album. He then took that tape, which belonged to CBS, and hawked it round Rocket Records and Virgin and Island, and eventually got us a deal with Warner Reprise at the same time that they had signed America and a band called Three Man Army. That was when Lou Reizner came into the picture. Lou Reizner was one of several producers working around in London that were suggested for the band. Kim said, "You're a West Coast band. You're more not really an English rock band. I suggest you go with Lou." And he said, "Lou's got a lot of clout in America." And so that's how we had our encounter and first working with Lou Reizner,
Wow.
who had just done Tommy with the London Symphony, with a cast of including Peter Sellers, Steve Winwood, Rod Stewart, had a hit with Rod Stewart with Pinball Wizard off that album. And so he was flying high off the success of that. He did Rod Stewart's solo albums, Gasoline Alley, and I forget what the other one's called. It's got a long title.
Raincoat.
Yeah, that's right. It's a bit like Prestidigitation. He must have liked that sort of thing.
Yeah. We should explain Kim Fowley then went on to become the guy who put together the Runaways with Joan Jett. He was also involved with the Ramones, I think. At one point.
And all sorts of people. Alice Cooper.
Yeah.
Kim was a publisher, but he was also somebody who just loved the whole theatrics of rock and roll. And by that I mean not just what you do on stage, but how you get indoors, how you get doors open, how you get deals for people. Yeah. And that very much, with Joan Jett, that very much, as we know, that was hard work to get that thing, especially in America. They were always behind the times, and punk and new wave took a little while. The Ramones and all those people didn't really break. I mean, Blondie was kind of a pop band, but really had aspirations to be part of that left field, you know.
Sort of
but they had to portray themselves as a kind of pop band. So that's how it was sort of tricky, because record companies had a very straight way. The reason new wave happened and punk was out of pure frustration from artists and small labels that came into play who actually recorded those artists, because the major record companies just weren't signing interesting acts. They were signing stuff that they were pretty, could mould into the round or square peg that they had there for the band.
Yeah. Out of those 3 acts that you mentioned, including Atlas, and at the other end of that scale, the signing of America to Warner Music, because America were actually formed in England, weren't they? Which is
well, that was sort of a game. That's probably why they probably found it difficult in the shadow of the Neil Youngs and Eagles, and which they were very much like. for them to actually get a deal in the States was probably really hard, even though they were American.
Yeah. I think they were all sons of army people
in England,
in
and also the American record companies were just getting their toes into England as far as setting up. Warner Reprise didn't really have an outlet. They were a bit like I mentioned. CBS was the Australian Record Club in Australia in the 60s. In England, Warner's was under the Atlantic umbrella, and they are actually setting up their own kind of label when they signed America and Atlas.
So America got all the focus. Atlas then didn't last that long.
It didn't, because there was just so many changes going on with the music industry there, because commercial radio was starting and there was a shift away from, we were sort of recording stuff that was probably designed a little bit for that English market, even though Kim liked us to think of us as a West Coast band. And somehow our single that we put out, which was called Rock and Roll Wizards, just didn't quite cut it enough to get on Radio 1, because it was just a little bit too heavy rock for them, for that middle of the road thing I was talking about. A little bit more hardcore, because we took ourselves pretty seriously as a hard rock band. So even though we'd recorded a couple of tracks on there that were singles worthy of that time, that you'd call BBC friendly, that wasn't the one they chose. The record label chose the rock one, and didn't happen. And Lou Reizner then had ideas already to record myself as a solo artist.
So you'd already done Tommy with the London Symphony Orchestra?
Yeah, that had been done a year and a half before.
So then, getting the London Symphony Orchestra on a Ronnie Charles record.
Well, he did Atlas, and that was just something, it was a 3-month event to record that. We went to New York and did the master cut for it there. And then, the band was still signed to the label, but because the single didn't take off, then commercial radio started. And what happened in England with commercial radios, they didn't have national commercial radios, they had them in different places. And the one in London was called Capital Radio. And that's when opportunities for new stuff. And Lou had just come off this extravaganza, if you like, of doing something like Tommy with the London Symphony, which he then restaged the following year with a slightly different lineup, still with Roger Daltrey, but he had David Essex. Keith Moon was doing what Ringo did on the first one, which was the Uncle Ernie part and all that sort of thing. And that's when he got the idea of doing Layla. And that came about because Eric Clapton was sort of rehabilitating himself after Derek and the Dominos, and he wasn't in great shape. And Pete Townsend suggested to Lou that he do a version of Layla. But Eric wasn't really up to it, but loved the idea of it. And as I had just done a stand-in for Richie Havens on the live performance of Tommy for Lou, being part of his, shall we say, his little kennel, he said, "Ronnie, you can do this." And I did Eyesight for the Blind, which was recorded, and
that's on the record.
And I've included that version on there. He said, "Well, I want to do Layla, and I think you could do it." So I certainly didn't say no. And as Atlas had failed, I thought this was a good opportunity for me to get my name out there, and that's exactly what it did. It charted mildly, but it didn't set the world on fire. I've got heaps of airplay, enough for 20th Century in the States to finance a full album, which was a very expensive.
I would imagine the London Symphony Orchestra, wouldn't come cheap.
At the time, the most expensive album produced in the UK was that album.
Wow!
For a solo artist,
That's incredible.
Yeah.
The choice of songs on there. So you working with Lou, with Tommy, with Pete Townsend, "Love Reign Over Me." Was Quadrophenia, I think. Wasn't it?
That's right. Well, talking about the title Prestidigitation, this was also out in the era of Ziggy Stardust and of Tubular Bells. Albums were very much still kind of in that prog music kind of thing where you had a concept. And Lou had a concept for it which involved a song called Prestidigitation, Mephistopheles' Paradise, and Every Harbour. And that's the concept that he was going with. However, when the American company put up the money for it, they said, we really like Layla, why don't you do some more covers? So, and we'd already done Wishing Well as well, which was from the free catalogue.
Take off your hat, kick off your shoes, you know you ain't going anywhere. Run round the town singing your blues, you know you ain't going anywhere. You've always been such a good friend of mine, but you're always saying farewell. And the only time that you're satisfied is with your feet in the wishing well.
The band Free. And the American company, of course, wanted American songs. Drift Away was included, and a Barry Mann song called Nobody But You. Barry Mann was famous for writing big hits like We Gotta Get Out of This Place.
Yeah. But neither of those made the album.
No, but we did do Drift Away.
Yeah.
And we did do a Barry Mann song called Nobody But You. But with this new compilation that I've done, I removed those two tracks because I wanted to keep it English-centric, which is what the original concept that Will Malone, the arranger, and I went with, was those original songs, Mephistopheles, Prestidigitation, Paradise, Every Harbour, Layla, Wishing Well, Something in the Air, which was a duet I did with Lou, brought in Speedy Keen, who was the singer and writer of the original. Again, being typical American producer, thinking this is a way of, getting attention for the album. And that got a bit of airplay off the album. But New Wave and Punk had just kicked in. And, it was also the halcyon days of the early days of disco with Donna Summer and all that sort of thing. It was a tricky time, and these newly found commercial radio stations were jumping on the bandwagon with punk and new wave. And apart from Layla getting a lot of airplay, I really just didn't get much of a look in after that. And then sadly Lou died that same year, just when I was overseas spruiking in the States for some more material for our second album.
So was that when it was time to come back after Lou was no longer there, or did you?
Came back to London, and I was still signed to his company. There was a lot of stuff, so it was a bit of a shock. I remained tied up with the Marty Machette, Lou Reizner organisation for another couple of years, and I just sort of moped around London doing a bit of live work, and we got involved in a couple of projects and things. I worked with Stomy Umashita, who's a Japanese percussionist who's very big in Europe and the UK. Toured Europe with him. And interestingly, Lou Reizner, when he first went to the UK, shared an office with Shel Talmy. Shel Talmy was another American producer who did all the Manfred Mann, Kinks, My Generation, the Who stuff. He was sort of like a Mickey Most, big singles producer. He had an apprentice engineer with him called Hugh Murphy. And Hugh and I became sort of mates because we used to hang out in the building there. And he, around sort of 77, got involved with Jerry Rafferty, who had just come out of Steelers Wheel, to do an album, which they call City to City. And on that album was Baker Street. And interestingly, the sax player, there's a guy called Raphael Ravenscroft, was just an add-on. And he was a guy I used to jam with in a North London pub that I said to Hugh, I said, you should try this guy out on the album because he blows a hell of a sax. And I'm not saying I instigated it, but interestingly, apparently the hook on Baker Street. Now, if you think of Steel as Wheel, a lot of Jerry Rafferty's hooks are vocal hooks, you know, ooh, and all this. And that's what that hook was. It was ooh, that little harmony
so saxophone interpretation of a vocal. Yeah.
It didn't, you know, they needed a single and it just didn't kind of, and they tried synthesizer, they tried it with guitar, but they got Raphael in and I think they tried a couple of other sax players, but they got him in and he blew the hell out of it. And he got an album deal out of that, which I then ended up working on that album as a featured vocalist with Raphael a year after that. So that took me up to the end of the 70s and then took me to the States, and I spent another 6 months over there trying to get a deal. But again, very difficult if you didn't have a green card.
No, but you had a few mates over there at the time, didn't you? I think, was that when Russell Morris and Brian Cadd were living in Los Angeles?
They were all sitting over there doing exactly the same thing, trying to get a deal.
And here comes Ronnie.
With my London Symphony album, which did open a few doors, but, you know, Brian had a good album called White on White, which was, I don't know why that didn't, it was actually a really good album, but it just didn't hit. You know, again, you know, the thing is to have hit records, to have hit albums and to really make it overseas, apart from living there, you have to have so many ducks in a row. And within a record company, every part of that record company has to be behind that act. I mean, I remember when what came out the year my Prestidigitation album came out was Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run. Now, they did a hell of a push of that in the UK, but it just didn't touch the sides there, you know.
Well, neither did Bruce's first two albums anywhere, did they? You know, he didn't do anything to us.
A legendary album, and it's still my favourite Bruce Springsteen album is Born to Run. I mean, it's just a sensational album. And when I heard it, I thought, oh, God.
Yeah. There was a time, so it must have been before you went to America, in England, where Peter Gabriel left Genesis,
yes.
And there were discussions that potentially you could have filled in.
Yeah, it was just
Peter
a little bit too late there.
Yeah.
They'd been looking for a singer, unbeknownst to me, and Lou got wind of it and said, Ronnie, I've set up an you got to go and see Mike, who's the bass player, Mike Rutherford, and it is Rutherford, isn't it?
Mike Rutherford.
Yeah. And I went to his place, a bit like this, and he had the guitarist there, and they played a bit of the album. They talked to me, and I had to sing through a couple of things from The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway and things like that, because they wanted a singer to do Peter's parts of their older stuff, and they'd just gone ahead and recorded the album without him, with Phil singing. But they were concerned about having Phil playing drums and not having a front man. And everybody had sort of written off the band once Peter left. But surprisingly, the album took off. Around the time that I was actually talking to them, it had just been released and it took off. So they just decided to go with it without bringing in another personality.
Oh, yeah, I think it became bigger than anything they'd ever done with Peter.
I would have been a good fit for them, definitely. That was, another thing Look, it's a sliding doors thing, but, I always say, I may have done that, but I could have been hit by a bus.
Yeah. That would have been that...
Still here, so I must have done something right.
Yeah, that would have been that sly reference to Peter's leaving in the title, and then there were three.
That's right.
Yes. And they had the hit with Follow You, Follow Me.
And look, he struggled too. I mean, he did a lot of live shows in the West End with his, masks and his whole theatrical thing. But... again, you see the same thing. A lot of those POG acts were struggling against this new wave punk thing because that was that same kind of era, mid-70s. It was all about the Sex Pistols and the Clash and and England just suddenly did this big switch, because I think they'd had enough of the Top of the Pops sort of glitter rock stuff themselves and tended to sort of, cast aside anything to do, especially with POG music, because even though Supertramp and that are a fantastic band, but they're all up there, you know. They're all these bands that were, Yes, of course, and, you know, all very high-flying bands that toured the States and had big followings over there. Even Procol Harum was still they were quite successful in the States, even though they really only had one hit in England, which was Whiter Shade of Pale. So England was starting, like it did in the 60s, to take its own course, and people like Peter Gabriel and the new Genesis were sort of struggling, you know, to kind of, they were going to be left behind, you know.
So when did you get back to Australia then?
I came back in 1980 for a bit of a look around, and then I got a call from a German record producer, John Jones, who I'd worked with his brother Trevor Jones, who did a lot of film track stuff in England, because they wanted to release Layla, and of course they'd approached the Lou Reizner estate in the 80s. It was about 82. So about a year, I came back here for about 6 months, and then I went back again to London and went over to Copenhagen, recorded a whole album called Hands Off, which included 2 of London Symphony tracks. And it was at that point that I discovered I had the mechanical rights to the album, because they said they went to negotiate with it, and looking at the contract, they realised that as Lou Reizner owned, because Lou Reizner owned everything he did. Mm-hmm. Producers did that then. The record companies would bring in these named producers, but the deal was they'd own the mechanical rights to it, which makes sense, you know. And so you learn all these things in the process about the industry, you know. And they just said, well, we went to go, and they said, we looked at the contract and there was a clause in there, just a funny old clause that was a standard thing in probably a lot of those contracts, where it said, oh, should the producer die, it reverts to the artist. And so that was early 80s. But apart from doing that album, which was released in Scandinavia and Germany, and sold reasonably well, because Layla was sort of ripe for the German market. They love all that, you know, anything big. So that gave me another life there. I came back, though, eventually in 86, because, you know, I'd been over there a long time, 15 years, and my father was very ill here, had cancer, you know, which he struggled with for 3 years before it eventually killed him. But so there were family reasons. I had a daughter here, so I came back to Australia. And it was a great time to come back because, you know, Men at Work, Crowded House, all those bands, In Excess especially, because In Excess really broke the mould in England for Australian music being typecast. All Australian music before that was always cursed with what I call the Rolf Harris syndrome, which was novelty stuff, push bike song, How's That? Even the only Men at Work track that made it in the UK was Vegemite Sandwich, you know, because they always regarded us as the Antipodean cousins who were always a bit of a laugh, you know. Yeah. So,
well, you managed to get your voice on a few other hits, albeit not quite songs, but more jingles, wasn't it?
Yes.
Oh, What a Feeling, Toyota.
Yeah.
Snickers,
yes.
Yeah,
so running on empty, and
people probably don't even realise that that's you.
Well, there was a lot of look. The thing I noticed too when I came back in the 80s was in advertising was run very much like the music industry in England. Everything you did, you got paid for. Whereas working live, especially at that time, when they really didn't want to know about my generation in the working scene in Melbourne, it was, and doing a bit of writing, to get jingle writing and stuff, was, you know, a way to make a buck.
Well, I tell you what, you should do your own greatest hits show, and in between the songs, sing "Oh What a Feeling," Toyota, Snickers satisfies. We could sort of have sponsors with you doing all the songs.
And what was the other one? California Walnut. Remember that one?
I don't remember that one.
California, here I come. You know, old Jolson impersonations. I could do them all.
Oh, you should just go out on tour and just do jingles.
I am a good one.
I'd pay to see that. This is a great story, Ronnie. There's so much to cover, and you know, we sort of hit the tip of the iceberg in this conversation, and still told a hell of a lot of stories.
Look, I've been really lucky in my life because I was born in that great era, and to have been able to do what I did, the doing was part of it. And look, in many ways, I'm sort of these days, when people drop like flies and people also being typecast, I've never been that. I've never, apart from, yes, people always think of me as the group and Woman You're Breaking Me in Australia, but one of the things that I had going for me that kept me doing work overseas even was the fact that I was a good professional singer who could do many different things, and the same in advertising, but they never thought of me as any one of those. So that has meant that I've had a professional singing career for 50 odd years, which I've been very lucky.
Well, Prestidigitation is sort of one of those buried treasures that somebody's found and brought to the
Well,
surface.
because of vinyl revival, it's been very satisfying for me to repackage the album, because what the original album didn't have was all this. I don't know if you can see this in here, but the story of Lou Reizner and Shall Tell Me, that whole era about him, and also the whole why the album came about, you know, and also on the back. So if someone pulls it out of the rack, if you read the back, it tells you what the album is, because we've all been in record shops where you'll pull something out you don't know, and you go, and there's nothing written on it. And you can see who was sort of the tracks or the titles, and then you go, well, what it was. And that was very much the case with the original album, even though it had this cute little cover that, because Prestidigitation is where the saying, hey presto, comes from. It's sleight of hand, that's what it means. And it had this little thing where the flowers come out there from the thing. But other than that, really, other than the lyrics to the song Prestidigitation, there's absolutely nothing on it that tells you anything about it except, you know, Harry Rabinovich is the conductor, and, you know, and Will Malone, the arranger, and of course we had a fairly impressive list of musos on it, which I've made a point of pointing out on this. Keith Tippett from King Crimson, who's a fabulous piano player, features on the track Prestidigitation, and any King Crimson fan would know his work from Cat Food. And if you've ever heard the King Crimson track Cat Food and 21st Century Schizoid Man would be the two most famous King Crimson tracks, because his piano is it's amazing, amazing. So, and Herbie Flowers from Blue Mink, you know, Take a Little White Man.
And Herbie also played with David Bowie.
That's right, yeah. He was the top. Well, he played in a lot of things in the 60s, as did the drummer Ronnie Verrill, played in all the Tom Jones stuff, all the James Bond film tracks, soundtracks. This was recorded at Olympic, which is where they did all that sort of stuff. Because the other thing about this album was there are very few really good recordings with a symphony orchestra and a rhythm section. And I think they really, from the process of doing Tommy and this album and Lou's other album called All This in World War II, which is a Beatles compilation with the London Symphony, with various artists performing Beatles songs, including the Bee Gees and all sorts of people, Peter Gabriel. I think his best work was this. I'm not saying this because I think the best examples of that recording technique is in this album. And having remastered it with a bit of modern fairy dust, as I call it, has really brought out that how the whole thing sits together. Because prior to that, other than the live Procol Harum album, Edmonton, and Nights in White Satin, there's very few recordings that was with the London Philharmonic, with symphony orchestras from that era. You know, now of course all sorts of people are doing it. But,
well, very few people can boast the London Symphony Orchestra as their backing band, so congratulations.
The other plug I must give this is Will Malone. Will Malone did all the Six Wives of Henry VIII and
the Rick Wakeman album.
yeah, and he's done stuff for McCartney and everything. He's a great arranger because his arranger used a lot of brass and stuff, which a lot of people tend to use in symphony orchestra stuff. There's lots of strings and it's all very smooth. This has got real edge, so. And it's Will Malone's arrangement skills, very good.
Yep, well, Prestidigitation, the name of the album. We should try and all work that into a conversation at some stage.
And it is available. I should let everybody know, which I keep forgetting when I do interviews, you can actually buy it at any reputable...
You say you can buy it at all good record stores and some lousy ones as well?
That's right,
yes.
Right. Now, it may not be in the racks, but if you go and ask them, it's in the system. And it's MGM distribution, and I know JB Hi-Fi are carrying it. So
and Songland Records Canberra, just songlandrecords.com.
If you want to, there's no CD. It is streamed through MGM, but or will be at the moment. It's just a single, but I'm going to sort of let the whole album go out that way. But I'd like for collectors or anyone who loves vinyls, this is it. Love you to buy it.